I interview a lot of doctors, especially when it comes to COVID, and they're giving me information of what they're seeing or the research they've done. But you've come at this from a very different angle as being someone, as I understand, that really understands it from the perspective of math and statistics. And so can you just give us a quick background of just, where is your professional focus?
Okay, so my focus is on using mathematics and probability to look at risk. And even before COVID, I was always involved heavily in research into risk of different medical conditions. I worked with clinicians in different areas of particularly chronic conditions like diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, those types of things, in determining things like, different risks for different profiles of people, optimal care packages, that type of thing. We use a particular type of mathematics probability called Bayesian probability, which is a little bit different to what most other people use, because in this area, you don't have masses of data. And where you don't have masses of data, you can't apply sort of traditional statistical methods. You have to use these Bayesian methods where you incorporate things like expert judgment with the limited data that you've got, and you kind of like build these causal models which help explain the data you're observing.
So that makes sense. So when you came in to seeing what was happening with COVID, for some folks, they maybe they saw it coming, or they already had a huge distrust of the government and big pharma, and they were already at the very beginning saying, this isn't right, I'm not going to go along with it. But also I think there's also people that are just very critical thinkers that just applied their thinking to the situation, said this doesn't really add up. So would you consider you're probably more of the latter, that you just were seeing what was happening?
Yeah, so, well, there are the sort of the non-mathematical things that you're seeing that happen which don't kind of add up, like the bizarre restrictions that were put in place, that type of thing. The sort of the TikTok videos when the hospitals were supposed to be overrun. You got that kind of weird stuff, but was really primarily driven by the fact that they were basing the whole narrative on flawed data. So it was really a data-driven issue, because every day they were publishing these data on the number of this massively increasing number of cases and hospitalizations and deaths due to COVID, and also publishing, there was this impression that the infection fatality rate was very high. People thought if you got this condition, then if you got this virus, you were very likely to die. And we knew very early on from the early data that was publicly available that was all complete nonsense. In fact, everything was really driven by this flawed PCR test. So basically anybody who tested positive on a PCR test, and we know how flawed those tests are, especially for people without symptoms. It's actually very unlikely that people who were testing positive and classified as cases actually even went on to get any sort of serious symptoms, or they were basically false positives, a lot of these people. Anybody who tests positive in a PCR test is classified as a case, even if they've not got symptoms, right? If you take someone then who tests positive, imagine this guy who tests positive. So 13 days after that, he's critically injured in a car crash and rushed to hospital. But he's classified as a COVID hospital admission as well. Okay. And if 2 weeks after being taken into the hospital, he dies of his injuries, then he's classified as a COVID death, right? Because anybody who dies, this is in the UK and much of the rest of the world, anybody who dies within 28 days of a positive PCR test was classified as a COVID death. Now, am I right in saying in the US, in some of the states, it was actually 60 days? You could be classified if you were PCR positive within 60 days, you'd be classified as a COVID death, right? It was driving a narrative in so many ways, especially when they could alter the amount of testing that was done. And, they could adjust the CT threshold of the test, so you'd get even more false positives, essentially. So they were able to create, initially, they didn't do much. Initially, the only people actually were being tested in the spring of 2020 were people who were already hospitalized and critically ill with COVID. So initially, it looked like the infection fatality rate was really high, that it really did look bad. But we knew that was simply because, you didn't know how many people really had this thing. And we also know with hindsight, of course, that a lot of those people dying who are classified as COVID, as dying from COVID because of the PCR test, even those who really did die, after having got a serious infection, a lot of them were actually dying as a result of the if you like, the inappropriate response to the virus rather than the virus itself. So, for example, certainly in the UK, I'm sure it was the same elsewhere in the world. Well, we're finding out it certainly was, that a lot of people, of course, die once they get the infection. What they actually die of is, in many cases, the bacterial pneumonia. And what they weren't doing, which they'd always done in the past, was give people the usual concoction of antibiotics for that. They weren't allowed to even give those things. They were doing things like putting them on ventilators, which is sort of the worst thing you could do, giving them things like remdesivir, giving them in the UK a lot of midazolam. These were the things that they were essentially killing them with this treatment, with the poor treatment. And that was what was killing them rather than the virus itself. So you had all of that stuff. And then they started to do this mass testing of asymptomatics. Once in the UK, for example, again, it's the same in a lot of states in America. Once they were easing the lockdown around about late summer of 2020, because the COVID cases were going down. But what happened was that as people were going back to work or school, they started to massively ramp up the testing. People had to get tested every day in order to go to work, to get to school. And of course, that massive ramp up of testing saw a massive increase in cases, but there was no significant increase in people with symptoms.